Hello and good evening. My name is Sanjana, and on behalf of the team of the Archives at NCBS, I'd like to warmly welcome you all to the 48th edition of the Archives Public Lecture Series. To those who are new to this forum, the Archives at NCBS is a public center to the history and content of biology in India. Our primary aim is to be a repository for all historical material, and in addition to this aim, we conduct a number of outreach and engagement activities. And this lecture series aligns with this particular aim of the archives. The series began in 2018 and is framed around explorations in and around the archives. And in the past, we've hosted discussions by journalists, researchers, artists, and many more who have drawn to their vast body of work to share their expertise with us. We are very happy to have with us today Rukmini S. Rukmini was born in Pune, studied in Mumbai and London, and had a background in social communications, media, and development studies. In 2004, she began covering the city of Mumbai for the Times of India, and since 2010, she has specialized in data journalism. She was the first data editor of an Indian region, beginning at Hindu and then at HuffPost India. She is currently an independent data journalist based in Chennai, where she writes for a range of publications, including Link, India Spend, and Development. Her pandemic podcast, The Living Curve, won an Emergent Ventures India COVID-19 Prize in 2020. Additionally, she was also awarded the Chennai Daily Jane Awards for an outstanding women journalist in 2020 and the Rico Award for Excellence in Media in 2019. Today's lecture is titled Data Democracy, How Democracy and Statistics Shape Each Other in India. Thank you for being with us and for being so generous with your time. Am I audible? Thank you so much for having me here. As I've been telling the people I've been talking to essentially, one of the big silver linings for me of the last 2 years has been the close interactions between the scientific community and the journalistic community. Something that's not always been a feature in the past, particularly for journalists like me who do not have a training in science or do not typically do science journalism. So I think this is a great sort of collaborative community that we're building. I'm also very struck by the work of the archives and in terms of building a public resource for the city and for the rest of the country to draw upon the work of the archives itself, as well as the outreach that is doing is really remarkable, and I hope to continue to be in touch with the archives. As Sanjana mentioned, I'm a data journalist, and I have this book out in December that sort of tries to draw upon a combination of what I found through data journalism, as well as what field reporting and conversations with experts were showing me, some of which complemented each other and some of which was at odds with each other, but both of those stories I felt needed to be told. What I'm going to try to do is not talk about the book, because the book sort of speaks for itself, and you don't need me to hawk my book over here. But what I'm going to try to do is sort of try to talk about the broader democratic background to Indian statistics, also honoring the sort of positioning in history that being an archive brings us. All my standard disclaimers at the beginning of such talks usually add that I'm not a mathematician, statistician, economist. I'll also add I'm not a historian or a scientist. I have two more disclaimers to that. But I think it matters to understand the history of India's statistical architecture, the democratic imperatives that drove it to be what it is, and why that matters for today. And I don't want to say quite clearly from the beginning that this isn't going to be a hand-wringing or a lamentation about our big past and our new future. I don't see it that way, and I don't want to make the argument that some of the great scaffolding that was put in place and still stands and can be built upon for the future. So we have not taken the paper. So there is no particular reason why India's statistical architecture looks the way it is, does the job that it does, and cover the issues that it does, has the sort of international focus that it does, has the sort of respect that it commands globally, as well as where it places us in the modern context. And that has a lot to do with the imperatives around the founding movement of India's statistical agriculture, which is something that I'll talk about a little bit. I just want to briefly mention some of the intellectual debts that I owe to what I'll be talking about. I draw quite a bit upon the work of the historian Nikhil Menon's new book, Planning Democracy, which talks substantially about the role of Mahalanobis in India's planning, as well as on data in particular. I highly recommend it if you're not recently. I also look a little at the work of the historian Sunil Kulkarni, particularly his book, The Idea of India. I draw quite a bit upon the work of the data journalist Pramit Bhattacharya, formerly of the Mint. And in terms of broad sort of economic intellectual depth, I sort of draw on the work of Amartya Sen, John Wells, and others. So the colonial state had a strong imperative for planning and for the collection of statistics. And this was largely driven around the aims of the colonial state. There is sometimes a sort of caricaturing that happens around the aims and the working of the colonial state. None of this is to whitewash the role of the colonial state, but it is also to put in perspective what data was being collected and why this was. I find this particularly interesting also because we often talk about baselines without ever thinking of it as a physical sort of existence, and then we looking at the actual measurement of the baseline made me sort of rethink what we think about as terms and what their sense of origin is. So we did go into our founding movement with a pretty strong architecture around the collection of statistics. The Gazette had existed. The Indian census, as carried out by the imperial government, had existed decades prior to independence. And at the moment of independence, statistics were also drawn upon to make political arguments. So the sort of critique of imperialism that came from the economic critique of imperialism that came from people like Dada and Nauroji, for instance, drew strongly on statistics. And in that sense, it has almost a sort of modern echo because it was a sort of critique that the colonial state was impoverishing the country. That was the basis of Dada and Nauroji's work. Poverty and British rule in India, which was drawing on statistics to make the argument that the colonial state was actively impoverishing the country. So statistics were being produced, they were also being critiqued and used, in the instrumentalization of a drive towards independence. But for the pixelization on that, this is an announcement of the first census that came out in 1951. I'll go a little, rewind a little, but just to sort of make the point also about the new and different imperatives of the new government. They were going to be significantly different, and one of the sort of big acknowledgements that happened right from the 1930s was just how poor the state of Indian data was, all of which again has been a strong modern echo, and how it was hampering planning. So right in 1937, the Congress Working Committee adopted a resolution at Waradha, in which it said the solution to problems necessary to any scheme of national reconstruction and social planning would require extensive survey and collection of data. Again, sort of very modern sounding declaration, but one that really sort of places in perspective what the newly independent nation was thinking of as why it needed to collect data and what it intended to do with this data. Nehru soon after, in a speech, said that it is clear that adequate data and information is of the essence of planning, and therefore the very first step that a planning authority must take is to organize the proper and scientific collection of statistics. He, in letters and matters to archive and material, it's quite clear that he was so horrified by the state of data at the time and really anguished or worried about how planning could in any way be affected given the state of Indian data at the time. the representatives of the government at the time even wrote to the imperial government saying that in the upcoming census they wanted questions on these particular issues included because they were very much thinking towards what the new nation would need in terms of planning. It's interesting at that time the sort of difficulty that statisticians had in engaging with science or pure science in that respect. So the Indian Science Congress in the 30s refused to consider statistics as a separate section of the annual conference, saying if statistics is to have a section, we may as well have a section of astrology, on astrology. And that actually makes me laugh because in some of the science conferences that have happened lately, we seem more likely to have a section on astrology than one on science. And I know this, who I talked about before, wrote a sort of complaining letter saying, with one or two exceptions, every responsible scientist in India looks upon statistics as that awful stuff with which economists and politicians play about and try to prove anything they like. So this was a sort of mutual suspicion and sort of semi-distaste that scientists and statisticians regarded each other with at the time. It's important not to make planning sound equivalent to Nehru and not to make statistics sound equivalent to Manu. It's not just because they are sort of romantic, overall romanticized notions, but also because they're not true. But it's difficult to understate the outside footprint of Mahalanobis on India's statistical architecture. He came to Indian statistics in an unusual and roundabout fashion. In some ways, displaying the sort of audaciousness that Indian statistics as a whole displayed at the time. He was planning to do and offering to do, suggesting, putting his hand up to do things that he didn't necessarily have the proven training or competence to do, but was excited by, including him, recognized his brilliance in taking him on to do the things that he was talking about. So, for example, his earliest published work, which was in 1922, was on the stature of Anglo-Indians. And this is something he returned to later, sort of similar exercise, which was a re-examination of anthropometric data relating to the tribes and castes of Bengal. Again, this has important modern echoes because the height of Indians and why Indians are far shorter than they should be in given comparison to other countries and given as genetic potential is an important issue to consider even now. So it's interesting to think about the issue that Mahalanobis was thinking and publishing about at the time. As you'll see, these are not sort of core socio-economic, statistical issues that he was working on at the time. But he also was responding to the needs of the time. So, for example, after the floods in Bengal, he decided to do an analysis of rainfall patterns, again, something that has significant further implications as well. So he was a polymath in true sense of. And in the early 30s, he set up the Indian Statistical Institute, which in a way grew from a table in his sort of study into the vast institution that put in place the world's most ambitious household surveying done in the 1950s. He also started a journal called Sankhya at the time in the 1930s, in which he published some of these articles I mentioned, for example, the anthropometric study of caste and tribes in Bengal. And it was a sort of occasionally esoteric and eccentric journal, even with people given the freedom to pursue all sorts of varied interests. But the growing closeness between him and Nehru and his sort of integration into the Indian planning process at the time, as Sunil Khilnani puts it, incarnated a deep rationalist streak in Indian intellectual life, a conviction that qualitative problems could find quantitative resolution. And Khilnani isn't necessarily being entirely complimentary when he makes this assessment, but it is important to sort of put some measure to the vast impact and this had not just on the institutions built on the time, but on the sort of broader outlook towards statistics that the new government had then. And initially, his task was to collect statistics around national income, but as we see, his and the institute's audaciousness took it far beyond what could have been even imagined at the time. One of the interesting things that I learned about the Indian Statistical Institute is that the way it operated was truly unusual as well, and in a way perhaps reflected some of the ethos of the time. So everyone at the Indian Statistical Institute, from the bottom to Mahalanobis, was there being as a worker. They were all workers, and everyone, including Mahalanobis, had to mark their attendance in the ISI. Finally, in 1946, the Indian Science Congress finally accepted that statistics could be its own separate section, and that sort of battle, that particular barrier fell following that. So I want to talk a little bit about the process or the conversations around surveying, and this is a theme I sort of return to quite a bit, because the thing that really set India apart in the early years, particularly in the 1950s, was sample surveys. And why should sample surveys matter so much, and why did we end up pursuing that path and doing a particularly good job of it? Mahalanobis was convinced, and the ISI was convinced quite early, of the great value of doing high quality sample surveys, in which you don't attempt to count everybody, but you count randomly selected representative sample. And one of the most entertaining stories that of around this time, which also has lessons about the spirit of adventure and inventiveness, has to do with the process of trying to convince the statistical architecture and the government at the time that sample surveys could do the job well enough. And instead of having this argument about should we be counting everybody or should we be doing sample surveys, it strikes me as truly unusual that in 1944, the Bengal government held a competition in which it essentially commissioned two surveys. It asked the Indian Statistical Institute to do a sample survey, and this was into jute yields at the time, because this was an important issue to be able to estimate sales and to crop distribution, all of these that mattered greatly to Bengal at the time. And it also allowed, on the other side, the government at the time to continue what they did, which was a plot by plot enumeration, essentially counting not every one, but every crop and every plot. And the ISI won this competition because their enumeration was off compared to the rest of official jute sales figures. This is a survey conducted by the ISI in rice fields, not jute fields, so a similar sort of vibe, but not exactly the same survey. The ISI enumeration was off by 1.66%. Sorry, the plot by plot enumeration is off by 1.66%, and the sample survey was off by 0.3%. Sample survey was also conducted at 1/10 of the cost that the plot by plot enumeration was conducted. And this sort of spirit of adventure and inventiveness seems like, when you think about, when people talk about polarization and arguments around data, it seems like a great way to think about how some of these issues can be, if not resolved, at least a direction to think about arguments around it. So one of the enduring arguments that we have around the National Sample Survey has to do with how we estimate consumption. There are multiple ways of doing it. One is through household surveys of the sort pioneered by Bundesliga and the ISI, and the other way is for the top down, which is to look at GDP statistics, national account statistics, and the two should add up, right? Discounting other things, national household level consumption should add up to what the GDP measure. But there is a gap between them, and it's slowing, and essentially this has become a polarized sort of left-right conversation. But this sort of spirit of adventure and open-ended inquiry seems like an interesting way to think about this, not resolving, at least airing some of these arguments rather than characterizing the other side as anti-growth or excessively anti-poor, as the conversation typically tends to go. Another sort of particularly striking thing about the work of the ISI, of Mahalanobis, and of the sample survey at the time was the, again, outsized and audacious internationalism in the approach then. It was established quite clearly that the household survey that I'll talk about in a minute, that India first did in 1950, was unlike anything, not just the developing world or the world coming out of the shadow of colonialism. It was unlike anything any country in the world had done, particularly one at the level of resources and development that India was at the time. Mahatma was interacted frequently with the UN and was instrumental in the setting up of the UN Statistical Office, which then went on to give direction to statistical offices around the world in their own, to aid them in the conducting of their own surveys. As the economist William Dennis at the time wrote about Mahatma, this no statistician ever had more influence on the entire profession and on governmental statistical offices the world over. So just how much of a giant India was at the time in terms of what it was doing is really something worth thinking about. This is when the physicist Niels Bohr had visited India. And again, the sort of collaboration between scientists across disciplines, across countries, is something really striking to think about. An interesting chapter in Nicholson's book, and again one that has strong modern resonances, is around the pursuit of computers, as he describes it from the early 1940s. As soon as Mahatma was heard about computers, he essentially was smitten by computers, as Nicholson describes it in his book. And for the next 20 or 30 years, he virtually pursued computers around the world, trying to get the first computers to the Indian Statistical Institute, convinced about the value of big data, which again seems like something governments might be arguing today. Ultimately, the first computer didn't go to the Indian Statistical Institute. It was brought to the Ford Foundation and went to the Yojana Bhavan. And there's a sad sort of epilogue to that story about how there wasn't enough trained staff, so it couldn't be run one shift every day because there weren't enough people trained to even use it. The use of it, the maintenance was a problem, and it became virtually unusable quite soon after. But again, this sort of ambition and sort of audacious thinking in terms of bringing things like computers to India was really a hallmark of that period. So this is the first national sample survey, which was conducted in the 50s. Again, in 1950, ran from 50 to 51. Again, it's moving to think about the work that went into it at that time. As it has been described at the time, 16% of India's land mass was unmapped at the time. So we talk about sampling claims right now. The NSS at the time, the National Sample Survey in the 50s had to virtually come up with a sample frame anew. There were entire regions where the population count was entirely unknown. Only the number of villages for the area was known. Convincing people about speaking to surveyors was an enormous challenge. This is not something, again, 1950 was not a particularly peaceful part in broad states of the country. There was deep suspicion about who these people were and what they were doing. What this would mean for their lives, for their safety, for money. So it's quite moving to read about the work at the time and sort of huge leap of faith that was taken. What it ended up doing was producing estimates of how households lived their lives that had been almost entirely unknown at the time. And that gave a significant impetus to planning, to know how to distribute resources. So, for example, in 1943, when the Bengal famine hit, prior to independence, the Bengal famine hit, there was virtually no information available about food availability and food distribution at the time. And Nehru remarked upon that about how much his response, or how much the colonial government's response was hampered by a lack of availability of this data. So all of it sort of fed into this desire to in a way be able to map everyone and allocate resources. So this was the house that Mahatma was built as the data journalist Pramit Bhattacharya had described it. And I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about how we have lived in the house that Mahatma was built. And if you want to talk about how we've lived in the house, there's sort of two ways of knowing whether you did a good job of living in the house. So one is whether the scaffolding held up. And the other is about what the tenants of that house did with the house, to sort of really set a metaphorical part. So one of the persons who's done sort of transformational work around with this sort of scaffolding with the house environment as well is the Nobel Prize winning economist Samuel Beaton, especially in his work with the economist John Lewis. So I want to talk a little bit about how he used the structure of this data as well as questioned it, because this in a way sort of exemplifies the interactions between democracy and statistics. And I'm going to use a couple of examples here to sort of bring home the point that both shape each other, and it is in the interplay between the two that hopefully we strengthen both. And it is in the gaps in this that we can start thinking about what we need to fix going forward, because this scaffolding has brought us here, but to take us forward, we face significant challenges. And this isn't all gloom and doom. There are significant challenges, but I'm also keen to talk about ways to fix it and ways to move forward. And it's an area, particularly in Bangalore, that I feel a lot of sort of energy and determination around. So this isn't, we don't move into gloom and doom from here. So in 1999, 2000, the samples, the NSSO put out a global sample survey. So essentially the fast forwarding to 1950, from 1950 to 1991. And you imagine that same sample survey that came out in the 50s, imagine it in 1999, 2000. And what this ended up doing in 1999, 2000 was producing a slightly more, a significantly more optimistic picture of how the economy, particularly at the household level, was doing than most people anticipated. And people like Adam Friedman and others began to look at the methodology and whether there had been any change in the methodology at the time. And they found that there had been some changes in the methodology, which perhaps rendered the findings of 1999-2000 incomparable with the past, and perhaps painted a more optimistic picture of household consumption and the economy than was warranted. Anders Eaton has also used the NSSO to make important contributions about things like changes in poverty, including significant periods of decline in poverty, and has contributed to sort of the global literature around poverty the world over. So, it's possible to do both. It's possible to use the statistics to make important contributions, but it's also possible to hold these systems to the light. It's also possible to speak to the power and question even things are going wrong or don't add up. Another sort of great combination of using the data as well as questioning it is more recent, that comes from the use of administrative data around NREGA. Excuse me, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And there's, this particular part of modern Indian history has been described very well in the book of the young political scientist M.R. Sharan. It's a book called Last Month Polls and focuses on Bihar. I recommend it highly. So, an enlightened bureaucrat in India's Ministry of Rural Development, not one individual, but let's focus on one individual to make it a more compelling story. Talked about the value of administrative data and how releasing it and making it more accessible, putting it all online, would be useful to people. And essentially what happened is that people, especially in M.R. Sharan's book, there are stories of people who were migrants who had left Bihar, for example, were in Delhi, happened to be near internet cafe, a cyber cafe in the early days of public internet access, chanced upon the NREGA website, looked up the muster rolls of their particular village, and found all of these days of 100 days work marked against the names of their own family members or neighbors in the village. Called them up and asked them, did you work 100 days and were you paid to me? So no, we've been working only 10 days, we don't even have a job card, we didn't get money for the days we work. And this is the sort of impetus that was able to, that people were able to use to ask questions of PNRG. So, again, great structure put in place in terms of making administrative data publicly available, great accountability tool put in place, and then sort of strong use of it by people, many of whom were not activists or not particularly educated, but
bureaucrats and push through in the rural development. To take that data source up from the Delhi Cyber and order the details of master role must be painted on the wall child office.
Usually step in terms of bringing data and democracy close to each other. Of course, when these questions are asked of local elected officials in particular, there is extremely strong pushback that people face, and they are often in grave danger. So there's that part of it to think about as well. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID and about the question of excess mortality through COVID. So just to give you a little background about what excess mortality is and why we're talking about it, the question of whether some deaths were missed during COVID is not necessarily a question of being suspicious or opposed to one party or one government. It is a question of acknowledging that countries around the world, including India, will miss some deaths during a pandemic. It is a question of acknowledging that India systematically misses counting deaths across diseases. In 2017, India's official death toll from malaria was 197 deaths, while modeled estimates put that number at 50,000 deaths. So if we think a 10x underestimation of COVID should be scandalous and national headlines, there's a question to ask ourselves about why we've never been so scandalized about this undercounting of malaria, diarrhea, TB, deaths from all of these diseases. So, this is why we think some deaths were missed, because all countries are missing some deaths, and because we often miss deaths from diseases. We also know that there was a very stringent definition of a COVID death that was adopted at the state and local level, which meant that only someone with a positive test no more than 30 days prior to death was counted as a COVID death. And all of us, we don't need to go far beyond our own friends, family, extended family to know that particularly in the second wave, people were dying untested, undiagnosed, and without making it to hospitals. So all of these give us reason to think that we are missing some COVID deaths. And I don't want to talk about the work that I did or about the work that other journalists did or about the WHO. I want to give you a couple of much more sort of local grassroots examples of the sort of the sort of contradictions between statistics and democracy, the coming together, and the processes of trying to make both powerful that did happen, and that shouldn't necessarily be sort of pushed back against or quashed or squashed in the way that often happened. So on the left is an example of what a group of doctors and people working in tech in Kerala tried to do, particularly in the first wave of COVID. They knew that the official numbers were not representing full COVID mortality. They knew this because they were doctors themselves. They were seeing people come to them with COVID-like symptoms and then hearing from their neighborhoods that the person had died a few days later, perhaps even without a test. They knew that individuals from families who they treated were not there, their names were not there in the official numbers. So they knew this was happening. So what they attempted to do was to scan local newspapers, both for news articles and for obituaries, and come up with their own basic Google spreadsheet of what they could see were COVID deaths and compare it to what the official death toll was at the time. And I think something to really think about in our response, and let me say at least the media's response, because I shouldn't hold you all complicit in this, is that the media in particular really needs to rethink its response to large numbers. And I mean this when it comes to crime, I mean it when it comes to disease and death, which is if the immediate response is to assume, the immediate reaction is to assume that a large number in one state and a small number in another means that one state has a large number of something and the other has a small number. In the background of knowing the vast differences in state administrative capacity, despite knowing that, we are doing a huge disservice to states that do a good job of reporting. Increasingly, I have come to the sort of conclusion that I can't really tell how much of interstate comparisons are comparisons between the actual incidence of, say, crime or death, and how much of it is actually a reflection of better state capacity in one state versus the other. And it's important to say that I can't say how much of it is because I don't want to ascribe scientific certainty to it and say Kerala's high numbers were because of better administrative capacity. I don't know how much of it was that, but it's important to at least complicate certainty in interstate comparisons. So what ended up happening, in a sense, is a sort of interesting mix of the combinations, the forces of democracy and statistics. I can't say whether this sort of work is what put pressure on the government or if the government intended to do this anyway. But the revisions that Kerala has made to its official death count from COVID systematically over the months has, sorry, could we, thank you, has meant that its official toll from COVID is the lowest underestimate if you compare with model estimates from WHO, for example. So again, the question there becomes, is it that Kerala has the highest toll or did Kerala do the least underreporting? So that's one question to consider. And, I just want to sort of give this as an example of extremely grassroots level holding governments accountable that people were able to do. Of course, there are limitations here, and this team was not able to keep up in the second wave where the media's attention, not just attention, resources got diverted. It simply wasn't possible to report on every COVID death in the second wave. Obituaries, not everyone made it to obituaries as well. And the second thing that I want to talk about is the sort of low-tech version or low-tech beginnings to the estimates of excess mortality through civil registration data that journalists across the country did, that then fed into the work of researchers, scientists, academics, and also the WHO. And it's important to talk about this sort of work is because not all of it was easily accessible civil registration data on a digitized state level portal that just needed sources to access, which is some of the work that I was able to do, for example. But some of it meant this, which is going to crematoria, graveyards, burial grounds, getting their actual registers, looking at the names, comparing it, counting ambulances, comparing it to the official toll, which is the particularly brave, risky, difficult, underpaid, at-risk work that journalists in non-English newsrooms across the country did during the pandemic. And it's important to make sure that the sort of credit for this work doesn't lie purely with English journalists who are able to have a higher profile, but typically do far less risky work than the work this would have required. So, and I just want to talk briefly about why the COVID numbers matter. In the inaugural issue of the Sankhya journal that I talked about, Tagore, who was someone Mahalanobis deeply admired, wrote a sort of editorial which Nikhil Menon in his book describes as baffling, if I remember the word correctly, because it's not entirely sure that that Tagore was very comfortable writing this sort of thing for this statistical journal, but it's a lovely piece of writing anyway. And one of the lines in it, Tagore's line in it is, "What we know as intellectual truth, is that not also a perfect rhythm of the relationship of facts that produces a sense of convincingness to a person who somehow feels that he knows the truth? We believe any fact to be true because of a harmony, a rhythm of reason, the process of which is analyzable by the logic of mathematics." And to me, one of the reasons this sort of struck a chord with me was because one of the conversations that I had with someone in the reporting of this book around COVID, and which is why, to me, the COVID excess mortality numbers matter. Behind these statistics I write about the COVID numbers is the story of what undercounting means. In May 2021, 32-year-old Rinku Parmar tested positive for COVID in the 9th month of her pregnancy. Within 2 days, she began to sink before her husband Manoj's eyes, and he got her admitted to a private hospital in Silchar, Assam, where they live. The baby, a little boy, was delivered by a C-section 2 weeks before the expected due date, as Rinku's lungs were on the verge of collapse and the hospital wanted to put her on a ventilator. 3 weeks later, she was gone. Yet her death certificate did not mention COVID. The hospital said that it was nearly a month since she had tested positive. The most recent COVID test had come out negative, and the district administration had told them not to count such deaths. her husband spoke to me over the phone and he said, to think that she didn't even count is an insult to her memory. And in a sense, Tagore's lines in this about the convincingness, that the feeling that you know something through numbers, and then the logic of mathematics proves that it's true, in a sense, represents to me the validation that a lot of people did feel through the work that we did around COVID excess mortality, which is to tell vast swathes of the country that the family members who they lost, who were often untested, undiagnosed, but were probable COVID deaths, to tell them that they didn't even make it to the numbers, is in a sense an insult to their memory, and is in a sense why both democracy and statistics matter. I just want to talk a little bit about the way forward, and I do want to reiterate that I don't feel gloomy, and I definitely do not feel gloomy in Bangalore. And that's for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is that I feel quite positive about the role that tech can play in holding, in speaking truth to power. Because in Bangalore in particular and across the country, there is a large constituency of public spirited, committed, often very young people working in tech who want to use tech to do good, data for good, as they call it. Many of these are not people who can give up their jobs and necessarily work in government or in non-government organizations, but there is this energy and thinking about ways to harness it, like, for example, the great example of COVID-19India.org, which is an entirely volunteer-driven effort that came together to bring together official Indian data on COVID from every district that exists in state-level bulletins, but is not being put together till date by the Indian government, and is provided as a freely accessible public good through volunteers. It's now called, not now, well, our successor is called COVID-19Bharat.org. This is a great example. The work that young people were able to do during the Kerala floods and floods in Chennai is another great example. So this gives me hope, and this is a constituency that I regularly interact with, and I'm struck by how much the desire to do good is there. I also see a great silver lining in the collaborations between scientists and journalists and people in government, outside government, trying to do good, particularly in the last 2 years. This is a great collaboration that's being built for the future. And again, we need to think about ways to institutionalize it. But all of these solutions, can only go so far if the basic democratic processes that are needed to hold power accountable wither away. And I'm not saying they've withered away, but they are under some level of attack. And we do need to think about ways to work on that, because all of the processes that allowed this great architecture to be built and to continue to be used required the participation of democratic forces outside government as well, within government as well. And I think the question to ask right now about people who are concerned about data is not just what is the problem with data right now, it's also to ask about what is the problem with democracy right now. Why is it that if a national sample survey is suppressed and not put out, why is it that a large enough constituency of people otherwise involved in the democratic process are not able to make their voices loud enough to force the government's hand to put that data out? So in a way, I think this implicates all of us in terms of thinking about, hand-wringing about the difficulties with data will only take us so far. Thinking more constructively about what are the democratic deficits that have allowed us to be here, how do we fill them, and what is the way forward is the area that I'd like to expend more energy on. Thank you.
Thank you, Rukmini, for that. I can ask the connection between what you've asked and historical sources and examples. We will now take questions from the audience and
Thank you very much for this very illuminating presentation. I never realized election statistics can be so engrossing and peppered with wit. I have just three broad questions. Now, regarding the colonial economy, you talked about the other minority as well. I don't know if you also looked at Ramesh Chandra Dutt's work of Economic History of India, which is quite exhaustive, and he being an ICS officer also had the access to the resources. And just drawing on the whole colonial data and measurement, where I think Malanovic started making a departure because it was very inspired by Soviet Union and the Soviet model, is that was a very agenda-driven in implementation, not in the data collection, what they did with the data. So I was wondering if you had something to say. Secondly, when I was a doctoral student, we had a joke: if you torture a data long enough, it will speak what you want it to. Now, and I'm experiencing this now because I'm involved as an advisor to a financial services project. So going back to that formula of GDP, which is consumption plus investment and the difference between exports and import, I'm wondering if this consumption doesn't reflect in GDP. Is it because it's primarily about food and fuel and life, shall I say, basic sustenance, or if it's refrigerators, cars, for example, electricity bill? If your bills are shooting up, does it reflect in the GDP figure? So it's a very curious thing, because I find in the investment, what we are studying as part of this project, it's very difficult to really realize how there are so many causalities. So in Kerala, you have much less Ponzi schemes compared to Bengal because the literacy rates are higher. There are things like that. And the third question I have is also related to a project which I'll be supervising, the statistical survey. Now, my PhD thesis was on administrative elites. Now, when you study elites, the sample size is what you call the information-rich cases. So if you're studying corporate CEOs in Bangalore, you can't look at 626. If 2 corporate CEOs will give you a lot more data than, say, if you're studying information technology professionals. So when you need the volume. So is there a correlation between the sample size and the specific research, where, for example, in your lead studies, you have very information-rich cases? So these are my 3.
Thank you. I'm going to have to give relatively brief answers to these because, I'll come back to my original disclaimers about not being an expert in all of the fields that that your question call upon. I'll say a little bit about what I can. So in terms of, the agenda or the sort of political environment and thinking of Mahalanobis at the time. Yes, but it's all that is true, but it's also interesting to think about how planning in particular was a sort of cross economic theory mantra at the time. Everyone from sort of New Deal conversations to Soviet conversations were having similar discussions about planned economies or planning in some form, and the role that statistics would play in it. So yes, the sort of political directions that shaped the first 10 and 20 years after independence had a lot to do with the direction and the work of Mahalanobis and others. But it's also interesting to think about how some of these basic principles were being adopted and thought about and talked about the world over, planning in particular. On the question of consumption, yes, I think the sort of big question that really does need fair assessment is why there is this big and growing gap. I mean, it's not a question so much of why, but what are the ways in which this gap can be bridged? And again, Angus Deaton has, acknowledged and explained a lot of why this gap exists for at least more than 15 years now. His excellent paper on it was in 2005. So it's sometimes, hard to decide whether we should be focusing our energies on closing that gap or whether we should. I mean, I suppose many people can do different things. There is a school also that thinks about, well, perhaps we should forget about this sort of conversation, do a better job of household level surveying. Are we capturing everything accurately? And an interesting part of the household consumption survey is that they have slightly changed the methodology that happens for the new survey that will go on in July, for example. So there'll be that, head scratching that we'll all have to do about when the new consumption comes out and how it compares with the past. And yes, I think one of the sort of critiques of the household consumption survey is that, is it doing a good enough job of capturing all that people, all the changes in the economy? So is it doing a good job of capturing things that, money that people spend on things that
they weren't spending on 30 years ago. Is the questionnaire modernized enough? I think this is also a question that comes up about unemployment. Are we capturing the different sort of ways in which people are employed? And yes, I think that there is ground to sort of question this and make the national sample surveys better in that respect. But I think what ends up happening is that critique sometimes goes too far, and there's a sort of, particularly when the survey is unflattering, the findings are unflattering, it goes in the direction of, let's jump this all together, let's look only at administrative data, let's look at EPFO to try and understand unemployment. So many people are driving Ubers and Ola, so that means employment's going up, in that sort of direction it sometimes goes in. About the question between sampling and what that can tell us, yes, I think, I mean, at a broad level, one of the things is part of the reason why so much of sampling or large sample surveys have been purely the government's domain, at least till the last 10 years or so, has been because it is so expensive and resource heavy to conduct a survey with a sample size adequate to say something substantial about India in all of its, slicing and dicing. But yes, I mean, there are questions to be asked about whether, for example, one of the critiques is that perhaps the NSSU doesn't capture the super rich well enough. So then should there be a survey that that is more information heavy in sampling the super rich? Those are all sort of additional directions perhaps to go.
Thanks for your talk. You mentioned that there was a change in parameters in the sampling of the national survey around the 90s, and how people have criticized that. I was wondering if you see a connection between, I guess, liberalization and the move away from planning in 91, and how did that affect data, and how did that affect, what you're saying is the relationship between data and blocks.
Thank you. That's a great question, and I'm not sure I'm going to answer exactly what you're asking. I'm going to answer something I want to say anyway, but it sort of has to do with what you mentioned, which is, and I don't know if this is the case everywhere or it just is because I happen to go to more left-leaning educational institutions and ended up in that sort of milieu. But I think one of the things that happened with liberalization, I mean, many things happened with liberalization, but one of the things that happened about the discussion of statistics after that is that it became sort of, for at least the next 20 years, all changes had to be answering the question of was liberalization good or bad. It began to feel like that. So even the early years that I was looking at data, I felt that essentially when any survey or any large data set came out, that ended up being the focus of a lot of the work of many economists and perhaps some journalists as well, which is it became so loaded. Every survey that came out, deciding whether it was telling a happy story or a sad story mattered so much, because then it would be seen as an entire referendum on whether liberalization was good or bad. And I think that did a big disservice to our understanding of the economy of statistics for a good 20 years after that. Maybe that sort of hangover has gone, but this is still a danger for other important sort of earth-shaking moments. So I'd say in the study of opinion polling and political behavior, sometimes everything is seen as a referendum on an event that perhaps didn't have to do with it. So surveys that were conducted soon after, political surveys that were conducted soon after demonetization were seen as proxy for whether people approved or did not of demonetization. While the very, if you're not asking a directed survey that's equipped to answer that, you're getting an answer and you're deciding that it's a referendum on a fact that you are interested in. So I don't, it didn't have an effect on that 99-2000 number specifically. That was a specific methodology change that was argued well. Both sides argued it well, and sort of, it was a good model for how we can argue about methodology in the pages of the EPW rather than slandering each other in press conferences as is more likely now. So that wasn't necessarily linked to liberalization, but yes, the conversation around them was particularly charged because it was seen as a referendum on whether liberalization was good or bad.
I read your book, which was was very interesting. You also mentioned just now that you're pretty optimistic about the future of the data points. And that's where I really like to ask you a question. So we've seen a few things, right? I mean, first of all, given the size of the surveys that are required to get a real grasp of India, and I'm thinking about democracy because it's going. The first is that because of the cost, is probably a bias towards the easier to reach and which are hence the better or more easily accessible, more easily communicable areas. So you're missing out a large part of the population which you can't access directly. And this also happened with the CMI pyramid survey, right? There was these controversial. The second part is that when it comes, so that's where the private sector comes in. When you come to the public sector, which is very the only one which has the resources to do this on a regular basis, we see what happened with various sample surveys, statisticians have made. The data itself is being called into question, but that is the only data that we have. So what is your cause for optimism?
No, that's a great question. Thank you. And sort of my answer is sort of partly within your question, which is, so the problems that we know that have happened with the NSSO in the last couple of years, the reasons we know that what those problems were is because the parts of the democratic process that should figure out what went wrong did figure out what went wrong. So people in the National Statistical Commission, which is the oversight body for the NSS, spoke out that that the survey on unemployment, which was conducted but hadn't yet been released, the survey on the household consumption, which was conducted but was being suppressed. The reason we know all this happened is because people in those bodies did speak out. And then we know that that happened is because journalists very much within the mainstream media did report this. So when we, I think it's very important to be laser focused on what exactly is going wrong and where there have been problems with the data. There isn't yet evidence, and I shouldn't be naive enough to say that there isn't falsification of fraud in data, but there isn't yet evidence of falsification of fraud in the national sample surveys. What we do know is what happens when methodology changes or when unflattering numbers are either delayed or suppressed. So I don't, what should happen when things go wrong, the self-correction or at least the pushback that should happen did happen then. So that gives me reasonable cause for optimism. I'd also say that the changes that have happened in a new survey that's coming out have again, people pay a lot of attention to this. A huge community pays very strong attention to this. So the minute changes, for example, going and serving a household once have now been made going and serving a household 3 times so that the questionnaire, which is very long, is split up. And asking questions about whether that's going to affect the sort of qualitative and quantitative aspect of the survey and will it be comparable with the past is already something people have ferreted out and put out in the in public conversation before the survey even starts. So all of these are signs to me of things working. There are bad signs. The fact that the 2017-18 household consumption survey never came up, was suppressed, is a sign of failure then, because then what should have worked. People spoke out, the press wrote about it, but still it wasn't released. So yes, that is a failure, and that I feel strongly about that shouldn't have happened. And I think a lot of people, even people aligned with the government, many of them do make this argument that survey should still be released. I mean, the government routinely trashes numbers that come out. So what was the harm in putting the numbers out and trashing it? They're free to do that. And I think the fact that we didn't all come together, again, let me not say we, people who should have come together didn't come together to insist that come out is a problem. We need to think about whether there are legal remedies to figure out how this doesn't happen, that you just don't release data or a survey you're not happy with. So there are causes for pessimism, or rather feeling that things didn't work. This is one. The other one that, again, I talk about frequently, but I don't think there's enough noise about it. And the fact that there isn't enough noise is a bad sign to me, is that there is a big data set of over 1 lakh rural health facilities in India. It's the National Health Mission's HMIS. It's administrative data that comes from every public health center, sub-district hospital and district hospital in the country. It's data on routine immunizations, deliveries, that sort of very bedrock services. And I have used that data during the pandemic to point out a couple of things. One is the lack of access to routine services that happened in the first shutdown, for example, which any doctor will tell you, right? The regular dialysis patients couldn't come, the regular cancer patients couldn't come. So I use that data to show that all of that had dropped. And then I also use that data to point to possible excess mortality in rural areas because deaths from fever and unexplained causes had shot up. After I did that and other people used that data to write academic papers as well, it was pulled offline and it's been offline for more than a year now. And that to me is a problem, that there isn't enough, not a single other media organization than the ones I write for picked it up or made it an issue. Not one MP has raised it in Parliament. So where there are fails, those are a problem and those do need to be called out. But I don't see evidence of sort of a mass decay of India's statistical systems, mass fraud, manipulation. Until there is evidence of it, I don't feel that it's happening and that it's something to be particularly depressed about. I'm not sure if that.
No, that's fine. I just
Okay.
want your point of view.
Okay.
Two questions. One is, should we be pushing for greater clarity on the concept we may call data governance, which draws a greater equivalence between the spatial scale at which data is collected and analyzed and the spatial scale at which administration happens. Because so that the feedback loops are closer. But right now the two don't map together very well. Second is, as data gets more and more digital and leaves perfect trails, so one starts moving more from sample surveys to almost complete data sets which can be collected and analyzed in real time. So there seem to be two problems there. One is the digital divide. In fact, that can have. The second is the data starts getting acted upon by algorithms that are so complex, even the designers of those algorithms don't have a clear sense of what's happening. So what impact will that have on data science?
Again, I'm not very sure I'm going to do a very good job of answering it. On the first one, yes, and I think we start right from very sort of brick and mortar examples like the NREGA in terms of bringing data and the people or the sort of data points in that data closer and what we can do about it. And in a sense, there are small aspects of the second part of it to pull into the answer, which is that's also something that's happening with geospatial and geotag data, which again, if there are ways we can think about bringing it closer to people, bridging the digital divide, those barriers notwithstanding, they can offer important accountability mechanisms as well. So for example, the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana has put out, the Ministry of Rural Development has put out this huge geotagged trove of information openly available to the public. They call it Geo Sadak. And for the PMGSY, they've put out geotagged data on all on all facilities, as they call them. So this could include a toilet, it could include a hamlet associated with the rural roads program. So again, it could raise an important accountability mechanism for people to see where are the roads being sanctioned, where are they going to, is it going to, locations that it should be going to, is it, as the governments would increasingly claim that rural roads now reach every habitation, do they really reach all habitations? That sort of work could increasingly happen. But yes, I do think that the second point is important and feeds into this. And I think we all saw it quite substantially, even when it came to this booking of vaccines through the websites, right? It left large chunks of people totally unable to figure out what they were supposed to do and ask other people for help. So that sort of raised a red flag, as well as other data that does show people who get left out and what that means for their access to services. The question you raise about big data and algorithms also brings me to another point, which is one of the areas that's lacking in my book is access to data from big tech companies. And I think this also matters because the accountability that we demand from government, of course, we cannot demand it at the same level from private tech companies who are not obliged to give us our own data. But the fact is that I was not able to get access to any anonymized data from any of the big tech companies, which now say so much about such a large share of the country to whom we, hand over so much vital information. But the information is shared in such a curated, restricted way, often to make a very specific point, and is largely unavailable to people who want to do any sort of investigative or sort of accountability holding information reporting. So that's definitely an area of accountability that's missing right now. And thinking about a larger architecture of accountability, perhaps even what the legal changes need to be, both for government data and for data from big tech, is something worth thinking about.
Yeah, I have a slightly personal question, since that your background is very different from what you end up doing later on in life. And so how was the transition? How did you get into this whole field of looking at democracy through the lens of data, and how difficult was that transition? If you could just reflect a little bit on that.
Thank you. Yes, I don't have a training in any of these fields. I started off as a journalist, and then after I did a master's in development studies, I for the first time came across research around South Asia, both quantitative and qualitative, that I had never been exposed to in my fields of study in the past. When I returned to India to journalism, I felt that I wanted to incorporate more of this research into my journalism. So the first assignment that I went on when I came back was to Bundelkhand to report on food insecurity. And while I would have in the past done it as a standard, prices are very high, people are sort of restricting their diets, this is what people are eating. For the first time, I was able to actually think about data sources that I could go to feed into the story. So what was happening to incomes, what had been happening to retail prices, what was happening to food baskets. Those are some of the data sources that I was able to think about using. This coincidentally, I think I sort of ended up coinciding with the rise of data journalism over the last 10 years in India. I think individual editors who placed a lot of value on data journalism and gave me a lot of support pushed me further along the process. Siddharth Vaidarajan, who was at the Hindu at the time and now founded the Wire, was one of the people who really focused on data journalism, hired me away to the Hindu to do data before the 2014 elections, and really sort of valued data, but subsequently as well, many editors have supported me on that. But not having a background in all of this means that the level of data work that I'm able to do is limited. But what this also means is that I have the potential, both in the past and hopefully for the future, to collaborate with people who have the tech skills to access and analyze large data sets. And I place myself in the position of finding meaning in numbers and telling compelling stories. So hopefully this, I'm not, if I was worried at one point about not having this background and not having these skills, I'm not worried about that anymore, because I feel like collaboration is great, and I see a lot of it, and I hope going forward that this collaboration between people with tech skills, data skills, and me with some experience in trying to figure out what the meaning of these numbers is and what the story is can produce good outcomes. So I think in the US, for example, or in many international newsrooms, to be a data journalist, you would need to have some tech skills and data skills yourself. Maybe it's too far down the road for that. So collaboration is a way.
That would we make to do such a thank you, Rukmini, for joining us. Please join us for refreshments outside where we can continue our questions. There is also a store outside with coffee with the musical, so please do stop by the store as well. Thank you again for joining us on Friday evening, and please keep an eye out for announcements for our next lecture. Thank you.
Yeah.